Right, okay, good morning everyone. Bore da pawb. Hope you're all keeping well. I've remembered to put the microphone on this morning. I know my voice isn't the strongest, so hopefully people can hear me a little bit better today. So first of all then, croeso, welcome back to us. And just wanted to say, first of all, that the session is being recorded as usual, and I just want engagement that you did with those Padlets in class, and also thank you very much to anyone who'd posted on that discussion in terms of some of your previous experiences about ALN or SEND as well. I'll post another discussion forum this morning. It might already have gone live in the last couple of minutes, I'm not quite sure. But just wanted to say really that if you do see on the to-do list a discussion forum popping up, A, it's not compulsory that you have to engage with it, and B, it's not marked in any way at all. Okay, so it is just an extra way of engaging. You feel you. If you look at it, doing that, that's entirely fine. So, as I said, welcome back then to our second session. This is what we're going to focus on. Spent most of the session really talking about what the and how we were going to do it logistically and what we were going to cover, and we spent a bit of time talking about the assignments in particular. So I know not everyone was here last week, so I'll just recap that briefly this morning. And then what we'll do, we'll move on to think about some of these debates in additional learning needs, some contentious answers sometimes. And as we said last week, very often that there is no one right answer to what we're going to be talking about. Okay, and hopefully going through this morning, you'll see where some of what we did this morning in particular can help inform that first assignment which comes in next month, and also depending upon your choice of topic for the second one may also impact upon the assignment you submit in December as well. Okay, so just a quick recap of what the module was about. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but really 4 modules which were very similar really, and in particular at the end of the module, hopefully we will be aware of what we mean by additional learning needs in Wales, special educational needs and disabilities in England. Different terminology, but the definition is more or less the same. Okay, we will also be aware of legislation. We'll think about what impact that legislation has had, and we'll also critically reflect on why it was brought in, what did it replace, what were the principles that were underpinning it that it was to achieve. We'll have a chat in a few weeks' time then about how you want to proceed with this 4th bit in terms of thinking about most common areas of needs that people working in the classroom might how common these needs might be, what some of the causes of these needs might be, how they impact upon those needs, how as practitioners we might need to support or manage the challenges and barriers those learners face. And then we'll also pick up on some of these contentious issues. As I said, there's no right answer, there is no one way that works for everyone potentially in terms of some of the things we're going to talk about. And then just as a quick recap, we said last time then the assignment for this module was relatively straightforward. 2 pieces of coursework of 2,000 words each, both worth 50% of your overall mark. So the module mark overall scores up, divided by 2 to get the average. Okay. And the first piece of coursework then, we looked at examples last week. We saw some excerpts from bits of writing that people had submitted previously. And one of the things that really stood out to you, I suppose, was the fact that this was quite reflective. And some of you kind of went, well, I don't quite know how I feel about that, because last year we were told we can't use I, and for this module you're telling me I can. So we'll pick up on that again going forward. And then the second one, perhaps one that you might feel a little bit more comfortable with, which is kind of a standard academic essay. And we said there was a number of choices for those. Just wanted to draw attention again, really, to these dates, and in particular to say something about the fact that these are quite close together, bless you. All right, so the first module assignment comes in then the 17th of November. The second one comes in the 5th of December. Realistically, as tutors, we've got 15 working days to get the marks and the feedback back to you, which probably means you're not going to get your individual feedback until the week before the second assignment's due in. Now, I appreciate that that's not particular. So if you're happy with this going forward as a way to counteract that, over the couple of weeks as we lead up to that second assignment, during our sessions, I will start to pick out some examples of group feedback at that time. So are there common things that are coming out in terms of people's assignments? Are there things that you're all doing really well, and I would suggest you carry on doing? Are there things perhaps that we need to pay a little bit more focus on in terms of informing your second assignment? So hopefully you won't feel that you're kind of left in the lurch, that you've had such a long wait to get the feedback. Second assignment is too late to do anything with it. Okay, so that's the plan anyway. So we said then this was the first assignment that you were going to be doing. You were going to be looking at this statement and reflecting upon, do you agree with this or not? Why do you agree? Experiences have you had that have influenced whether you or not? And some of you quite rightly said, 19, I've spent most of my life up until now, I don't really have any professional experience in relation to this. Equally, some of you have talked about, well, family members that have an identified area of need, but I might discussion. Some of you have talked about, okay, I'm actually doing some part-time work, and I have seen some of these things in practice. And realistically, depending on your level of, no one right way of doing this. Okay? So we'll pick this up again as we kind of go through. So the first part of the assignment was looking at this statement. Education should include everyone. And I think the consensus last week was we kind of agree with that. The bit that's perhaps open to some debate. Should all people, disabled and non-disabled, be taught together in the same setting? Okay, so there are different ways we can look at here about whether we should have all learners together in mainstream schools. Is there a reason to have special schools? Are there advantages and disadvantages of some of those things? And some of you last week were talking about, well, actually, you know what, I special schools and I can see the benefits that they bring. So there are some areas here that are open to debate. And some of what we talk about this morning and kind of links to this as well. Okay, so that was the first assignment then. This is the one you saw those little examples of last week. All of those passed. Some of you were quite harsh about the one that scored the highest last year, that had the 75, I think it scored. Some of you put that in the fourth. But you were all pretty close in particular. Looking at those is helpful in some way. And then this was the second part of the assignment then coming in December. Again, to perhaps more of a standard essay. So you'd be using kind of third person. And you've got a choice then of any one of these four topics. No expectation that you know at the moment which one you're going to do. No expectation, realistically, that you start looking at one is coming. But these are the things you're going to be for. You're going to be thinking about the impact of labeling, and that's something we're going to start to touch on this morning. Is it an advantage for a learner with a need to have a label attached to them, or you might want to think about We have a piece of legislation which came in 2018 called the Additional Learning Needs and Educational Tribunal Act, which has informed where we've gone in Wales, moving from SEN. So, looking at why has it come in, has it had an impact, has it made things better or not? Or you might be more interested in learners and particular needs and challenges they face. So this third one gives you the opportunity to focus on learning. So asks you to think a little bit about and to think about impacted as a result of that. Thinking about this room we're in, that noise of the air conditioning, I can't quite get past. I can still hear that constantly. It's drowning out. Thinking about a learner with autism and sensory challenges, for example, that might be a real barrier to learning. Or you might want to focus again on inclusion, and if you do this one, your main challenge, I suppose, for in the same thing. So as I said, we will touch on the assignment every. Well, this is what we've covered today. This is how you might want it. No questions? Go for it. Yes. No, so you could look at any of those, so you could kind of go down the Asperger's route if you wanted to. So I suppose some of those kind of more I've been overarching label, you could link that into that. Yeah, so anything that comes under that umbrella term ASD, then that would fit for the purpose of that. Okay, excellent question. Is there a penguin or what? So this is what we're today then. So we're going to think about some different debates in relation to learners with additional learning needs. And we're going to think a little bit about this term inclusion. What does it mean? And I haven't phrased this very well, but how do inclusion in practice, especially? We'll think a little bit about labelling, having a diagnosed need, official or not. We might mention perceptions a little bit of our session in week. We'll start to think a little bit about support learners. Lots of debate in the press, for example. What do we? It's an awful long time. Diagnosis of need. So that ASD one in particular is a real challenge. Okay, so I live in far west with Pont. There was a 7-year waiting list. Appointment with a paediatrician to start to discuss an autism diagnosis. Actually, that learner who's starting to show increasing not have had that. Okay, and we'll think a little bit about the voice of learners and families. And I think one of the things we used to be quite in education was we did things to learn, necessarily asking them their opinion on what they would like and thinking about parents. Okay, so that's which flows into. Start with this quote, and this is from Thomas, not me. I think he was called Gary Thomas. I could be making that up. So Thomas suggested that few people to know very much about why schools exist as they do. Now, if I asked you to describe a school and tell me what a school is, they're not going. Or you could all give me a pretty good definition of what that means. However, it's look like they do, but they always don't look and work the same in every country. So most of you would have of a similar age, which is a lot younger than me. I'm guessing the school you went to would have been quite similar to each other. That was probably similar to your parents' school setting as well. Depending upon how young you are, that might have been quite recognisable for your grandparents. Go back a little bit further, schools today. Before World War, we didn't have secondary. Tended to stay in their primary school until they were 4. So, do schools today look like they always have done? Do schools in Wales and how they teach and what they teach and how they're set up? Are schools, and I don't like the way I phrase that, but are schools set up correctly and as effective as they could be? So even if we just think about some of the differences between England and Wales, for example, foundation phase and foundation stage, learning the age of 7 in Wales. Why are those scales differently? Does it have an impact on learners? Why, if we kept special education but moved to additional learning needs in Wales? Why is the new curriculum in Wales increasingly different to what it is in England? Okay, and if you've experienced schools and they work different, taught, I don't know, the different forms of tests and assessments did you go? Is one of those systems better than the other? Okay, so lots of questions where there is no answer. But just to be annoying this morning, what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about some questions. So I'm going to put them up on the screen. I'll then flip it over to the next slide that's got to a Padlet on it. If you are able to get on Canvas, you see the Padlet on there as well. If you want to move, you want to turn around and work with people sitting entirely up to you. Some answers to first one. I think this sounds relatively straightforward, but maybe not quite so easy to define. So I said a couple of minutes ago, we can probably all agree on what a school is. Right? But this first question, how would you define education? Okay, and if we think about the word education, it comes from Latin, and it comes from two particular words in Latin, both of which have got a slight... So it comes from educare and educe. For example, means to bring or rise up. Educe looks at drawing something out. In terms of education, is our purpose to take children and see them as this unformed lump of clay and build them into something bigger and better? Or is the purpose of education to work with those learners, understand their interests, and build on those? Is it some kind of combination of them both? Or is it something different again? So that's the first question I'm going to ask you to think about and post some answers on in groups. Second one, again, no right answer for this one. Having defined education, what do you think the purpose of education is? Your parents sent you to school because you're still in education now. Why? What's the purpose of that? Okay. Third question, is the purpose or should the purpose of education be the same for all learners? Fourth question, should all learners be offered the same education? In other words, taught the same things in the same way, in the same place. And then, without going on our friend Google, I'm going to ask you to think about how you might define these terms at the bottom. And these words at the bottom, particularly we'll pick up on a little bit later this morning, very much go through the history of additional learning needs have been treated. Exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion. So, a few questions there. So, as I said, what I'll do, I'll just move on to that slide. If anyone wants to do it on their phone, then you can open the link code. Equally, the Padlet is up on the additional resources tab for the module this week. And then, same as you did last week, if someone in your group is willing to kind of collate your answers and then start to post these on the Padlet. Okay. So, if I go back to that slide there, so those are what I'm going to ask you to think about. Quite a lot there to unpack and unpick. Again, no one right answer to any of them. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes or so. Does that seem okay to kind of get started on that? If you want, actually, safety in numbers, if you'd rather work this as a group about or set yourself up however you want to. Okay? And as you do that, I'll come round and annoy people individually. All right? So any questions, please, otherwise, in your groups, have a look at those questions, post some answers onto that. Okay, another couple of minutes then, some really nice comments that people have put up so far. Thank you for posting. Some of those questions, there's more of an agreement as a group as to what people think, and then some of those a little bit more open to debate. Some of the key things I think people have said, or I've earwigged listening in as I've about the room, is that a lot of these things perhaps are quite straightforward and simplistic in theory. However, when we start to think about individual learners and their needs and their circumstances, then things become a little bit more murky and a bit more open to debate, potentially. So if we look at some of the comments people have put up, I've got to be honest, I can't read that on the screen and I've left my glasses in the car. Some of the key comments about the defining education has been to do with passing information, passing knowledge. A couple of people have posted things talking about a more knowledgeable person passing knowledge on to somebody younger or less knowledgeable, for example. Okay, so education then, something to do with passing on knowledge, something to do with learning, seems to be the main comments coming through. In terms of the purposes of education, okay, so I quite like this one to start with, that well-rounded person. Okay, a lot of you were talking about is not just academic learning. Okay, talking about physical development, social development, emotional development. Okay, valuable life skills. Okay, develop the necessary skills to succeed in their modern world. Okay, I think that's a really interesting comment. Something which really makes me aware of my own mortality, for example. A child born in 2023 isn't going to start school until 2027 and realistically isn't going to retire until... How do we know that what we teach them 12, 13 years that they're in school is going to be relevant to how their life is going to be as we get towards the end of the 21st century? Okay. My mother was arguing with my nephew one day last week when she was helping him with his homework about the fact that he doesn't do joined-up handwriting. Okay, and he said, well, when I was in primary school, they didn't teach me joined-up writing. Okay, and it's very common now in many schools to not teach joined-up and to just do print and typing. However, my mother, who's 70, that was a huge part in terms of her education, was in terms of learning to write joined up. Okay, so just a flippant little example really, but thinking about some of the skills that are necessary. Is the purpose of education the same for all learners? Okay, so again, we've got a few different comments here. So I like this one about the person-centred education. In other words, we need to tailor this in some way to the individual needs. Okay, and some comments here which a lot of people were kind of talking about really, which link over the couple of points there. Maybe the overall purpose is the same, but how we get there is different. Okay, and finally then, in terms of some of those definitions, so we've got exclusion, so not being allowed to take part in something. Segregated, similar to exclusion, but we're categorizing people and keeping people who are alike in some way together but away from others. And then we'll pick up on these points on integration and inclusion going forward. Okay, so some really nice points there for that. Thank you for sharing those. Okay, so what I've got up on the screen now are thinking about the purposes of education. If you type that into a question in Google, these are some of the things. Okay, and I'd like you to have a think about some of these comments and do they with some of the things you said. Okay, so someone has suggested, this is quite highbrow, this one, the purpose of education is to bring people to a realization as possible of what it is to be a human being. Anybody got any idea what that means? Okay. Second one, to give all learners the basic skills, so quite a few of you mentioned skills, to access and drive their own education. Okay. Anybody agree with that one? Okay, yeah, kind of agree with that. However, begs the questions, what are the basic skills that we need? Okay, maybe something in there in terms of independence. Third one, to develop the soft subject life skills. Always stuff in the papers about why don't schools, about how to open a bank account and how to set up a mortgage and things. Okay, going through school and thinking about the age you are now, would those kind of life skills that don't necessarily fit into a yeah. Okay, full subject knowledge. Okay, now I don't think anyone in the comments mentioned subjects, but if you think about when you were in school, what subjects did you do? What were the key things that were taught in those subjects? Right? Who decides what it is we teach? Okay, how many of you liked history when you were in school? Right, I've got to be honest, I hated history when I was in school, so I didn't like the teacher, but I ended up teaching history as part of my job years later, which is quite ironic. But thinking about when you were in school, how many of you spent much time learning about famous females from history compared to famous men in history, for example? Okay, thinking about history curriculum 30, 40 years ago in the UK, we talked a lot about the advantages of the British Empire and how great it was. Okay, how much of that today is focusing on things like decolonisation, for example, and thinking about the benefits but also the challenges of the British Empire. So the knowledge that we're teaching in subjects is subject to change over time. To give the young the things they need in order to develop in an orderly, sequential way into members of society. So some of you talked about virtues and morals and values and ways of behaving, for example, and what is seen as being acceptable behaviour. That maybe is something we should try and get across in education. Main purpose of education is to help students get the knowledge and skills so that they can function. Okay, fair enough. But what is that knowledge they need? What are the skills they need? Is the knowledge and skills that you've been relevant to you in 2068 when you're still working, for example? Education is about the practical business of ensuring that young people receive the preparation they need to secure a good job. Okay? So education of getting people in. Okay? Does anybody disagree with that one? A couple of people talked about, well, do you know what? Not all jobs are academic. In Germany, for example, at the age of 14, you're allowed to drop some of your academics and follow a vocational apprenticeship type pathway. Okay, we don't have that in schools in the UK. Might that be beneficial? Okay, and then this one suggests there are three purposes: empowering young people to succeed in the economy, in other words, get a job, take part in culture, and leave school prepared for adult life. Okay, I'm 49. Did you feel prepared for adult life when you left school or college when you were 18? Do you feel fully prepared for adult life now? If you do, then you are in a better place than me. Just thinking about that, and you might have touched on this last year, if you'd looked at the new curriculum in Wales, for example. I've had to write these down because I can never remember them. But the new Wales is underpinned by four particular purposes. And the four purposes of the curriculum in Wales apply to all learners with ALN. Okay, and this is what the Welsh are taught in schools in Wales, how it's taught, what's in it, how it's assessed, should have these purposes. So, We want all learners in Wales to be ambitious, capable learners who are ready to learn throughout their lives. Okay? In other words, learning doesn't just happen in school. It's not uncommon today that people have 2, 3, 4, 5 different careers in life. Okay? You left school at 15 or 16 and you stayed in that job until you retired. That's very uncommon in today's world. We want learners to be enterprising, creative contributors who are able to play so how Wales fits in. And to be ethical and informed about some of the challenges that children are going to be increasingly facing as they move into adulthood. And finally, one features a lot, I think, in terms of some of the comments you'd posted. We want through education to be healthy, confident individuals who are able to lead fulfilling lives and valued members of society. We're going to kind of come back to this morning, really. How do learners with ALN fit into that? Are we ensuring that all learners, regardless of their needs and challenges and backgrounds, are ambitious and capable? That they do have a part to play in life and in work? That everyone is ethical and empathetic towards others? That everyone goes through school and leaves school both physically and mentally healthy and is a valued member of society? Okay, so some quite big aims and purposes in the curriculum in Wales, and as I said, we'll try and touch on that this morning in terms of I think we can achieve that for all learners. Okay. Just wanted to spend a couple of moments really picking up on some of these words which you were looking at the last question a few minutes ago. And these words realistically kind of go through of how or special needs or disabilities have been treated by since the start of kind of formal education towards the end of the 19th century. So what we've got are a series of quite simplistic. We think about this blue circle as being rules. These green dots are going to be learners who, in the terminology of the time, were seen as being normal, and other learners who didn't have a need. And then these other random symbols are learners who do have some kind of need. So thinking about when education first started, so formal schooling coming in at about 1870, for example, we started to see schools being built with an expectation that children who were seen as normal would attend. So those children who were deemed to be not normal, and we'll have a look at some of those labels a little bit later on, well, they were left to fend provision unless you were deemed to be normal enough to attend school. So for a large chunk of time in relation to education, with needs suffered from exclusion. Schools were kind of a closed club, and if you weren't deemed to be normal enough to come in, then there was nothing for you. As we moved into the early 20th century, so from about 1912 onwards, we started to see more and more people realize a particularly satisfactory state of affairs. And what we started to see now with this smaller blue circle is the advent of the introduction of special schools. So the big blue circle still got normal schools for normal children. Apologies for the language, but we're now starting to see that all learners should be. Those learners who weren't seen as being normal were now starting to receive an education which might have been different, and it was somewhere else. Okay, so they still weren't invited into mainstream school. We now had something in place for them, but they were segregated. Moving into the 1970s and 1980s, and arguably still very common in schools today, we start to see more of this integration. And if you start looking through the literature as you go through the module, you will see people use the terms inclusion and integration interchangeably. They don't necessarily mean the same thing. So, if we look now at these learners, if the big blue circle is mainstream school, are all learners now having the opportunity to attend those settings? Yes. However, we've still got this boundary around those learners with needs. So those of you who went to or have worked in a setting, for example, where there is a particular unit, so you might have gone to a mainstream secondary school, but they had a specific nurture group focusing on supporting the mental health well-being of learners, which was slightly separate. It was on the same campus, might even have been in the same building, but it was in a separate area. Or a particular unit supporting learners with autism, for example. So they're in the same school, but in a slightly different unit. And potentially, those learners might spend all their time inside. But when staff have deemed that it's appropriate, those learners might now be invited in to the mainstream classes for some of their day. And the expectation here very often was that those learners had to show that they were normal enough to be allowed in to have that opportunity. So arguably better than that. Arguably much better than that. But the debate comes around, are those learners still being segregated? And then inclusion, where we're kind of moving towards today, all learners, regardless of need, mixing together in the same kind of school setting. Okay, so these are some of the things that you're going to pick up on as you go through your assignment. Just wanted to mention, with needs, didn't have education provision at the start. There were some areas of need where there was. And looking at the name of some of these schools, you can see that they kind of specialised in particular areas. And equally, from a 2023 perspective, some of these might now be seen as a little bit offensive, perhaps. So, some learners in particular, the blind and visually impaired. They were early examples of schools. So we've got School of Instruction for the Indigent Blind. So the poor, the needy, the destitute. We had the School for the Indigent Blind again. Anybody got any thoughts on this one? The Asylum and School for the Indigent Blind. We hear a lot in the news about the word asylum in relation to migrants, for example. People seeking asylum. So attending the asylum and school, that there wasn't just teaching of skills going on, but it offered a place of safety. Don't think we could get today. The cripples. Specifically set up in a part of London for those girls who were physically handicapped, who were taught particular skills which meant that they could go and work in the newly opened factories in London. The Training Home for Crippled Boys. Similar kind of approach. Okay, some of these schools, for example, this one in London, one of the key things they taught in their curriculum was how to play the piano. Because there was a big growth in jazz clubs opening in London, and the thought was that if we can get these learners to play the piano, then despite their disability, they would always be employable because they'd have a particular skill that was useful in society. Probably don't think we could get away with this one today either. the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots, okay, which is this building here, and hasn't that long closed down. Okay, it ended up becoming the Earlswood Hospital, and this was a setting that was set up for learners who today we would see as having kind of social, emotional, and mental health needs or learning difficulties. Does anybody watch The Crown on Netflix? Episode in one of the series where I think it's Princess Margaret goes to visit this hospital, and you see her talking to two women with learning difficulties, who were two cousins of the Queen, for example, and I think 5 other members of the family lived in this institution as well. And this was seen as being quite a stain on the family. Okay, and it was noted in the 1950s that these 2 women had died. However, one of them lived until 2014. So there was a shame and a stigma attached to that area of need. I do quite like the name of this one, which is this school here, the College for the Blind Sons of Gentlemen. Okay, so this was a private institution in war veterans to send their children if they had a visual impairment. Some of these schools ended up linking into the National Institute of the Blind, the London Society for Teaching the Blind to Read, so a very specific focus here on teaching Braille, and then just an example of something slightly different, that would mean they could get jobs working. So, how many of those schools today do you think would be seen as being appropriate? Some of them, potentially. So you still have particular schools for children who are blind. Potentially that is... Really don't think any of you would want to send your children to the Asylum for Idiots, for example. So just some examples there of how our perceptions towards learners has changed. Mean inclusion and how this links to the assignment. Okay. Right, okay. We'll make a start back then, if that's okay. So before we had a little break then, we were looking at some examples of how and where learners might be taught. We'd thought a little bit about schools which were set up to meet particular needs, which we could look at in one way as being positive, or we could look at it from a different perspective and talk about these learners being segregated. They're not taught in a mainstream school, they're taught somewhere separate out the way, but they are being taught. Different arguments you could have in terms of disadvantages in terms of that. So I just wanted to mention this briefly this morning because this will link quite a lot to the first assignment, and potentially if you choose the fourth on this one again. Okay, so we've used the word inclusion quite a lot this morning, and we will probably look at this every session together. One of the challenges we've got in terms of inclusion is there is no one standard definition. So you could have 2 different schools who do things differently, but both of them fit with their definition of what they perceive. Equally, you could have 2 teachers working in classrooms next door, same school. If they perceive inclusion differently, their practice might be different. So there are many, many different examples of definitions of inclusion, but 3 as an example. So has anyone heard of the Warnock report, for example? So the Warnock report 1978 was a very influential piece of work which led to special educational needs being defined. Before that, children were seen as having handicaps. Okay, and Baroness, as she was Mary Warnock, suggested that inclusion was everyone, regardless of their needs, being involved in a common enterprise of learning where everyone learns best. So thinking back to that purpose of education earlier, and should it be the same or different for everyone, she suggested learning should be a common enterprise. Didn't say it should be the same, but everyone, regardless of their needs, should be involved in education. And the next sentence goes on to say, inclusion means that all children should be taught in mainstream school. And many governments have looked at the sentence and kind of in at that point, potentially, and that's led to the reduction in special schools right across the UK. However, if we carried on that sentence a little bit further, it suggests that all learners should be taught in mainstream school if it's what the parents of the child want, and if the mainstream school is able to meet the needs of that learner. Okay, so we could argue, if a learner is in mainstream school, but their needs are not being met, are they included just because they're in the same building as everyone else? Or does inclusion mean a bit more than that? Okay, so a little bit more up to date now then, this one, and I'm guessing this is just about when many of you were born, which depresses me. So UNESCO 2005 suggests that inclusion is seen as being a process. So it means doing something, it means being active. All learners, okay, so everyone should be involved. Participation in learning, reducing exclusion, and it talks about the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. In other words, mainstream school. So this one talks about all children should be involved in learning, might be different for different people, should be in mainstream school if that's what the parents want and the schools can meet their needs. This one says it's an active process, we've got to be involved, we've got to want to do this, we're going to have to try and ensure that everyone gets an equal opportunity to engage, we're reducing exclusion, and it should be mainstream school that can do that. And this one then, more recently again from the Welsh Government, inclusion is a process through which pupils access common opportunities in ways relevant to their needs, which I think chimes really well with a lot of the comments you said earlier on. There's different ways potentially people get to the relevant outcome. And if we go through, talks here, inclusion is more than just being placed in a particular type of school. Okay? Just because you are in a mainstream secondary school, are you being included? Just because you were taught in a special school, are you being excluded? Just because you were taught in a pupil referral unit, are you being segregated? So there's perhaps more than just where the learner is involved in inclusion. Okay. Just going to ask you to think about this for the next couple of minutes, really. So we've talked briefly about inclusion, and this is something, as I said, we'll pick up more on as we go through. There's an increasing drive worldwide towards inclusion, whatever that might be, which suggests that it's a good thing. There's benefits for it. And some of the key benefits that have been put forward for inclusion, I've put up on the screen here, for example. So some research suggests that learners with additional learning needs or special educational needs do better academically if they are taught in mainstream school. However, other research says they do worse. Other research says it makes no difference. Other research says they do better in special schools. So potentially it depends very much on the individual learner and the school they go to. Inclusion has also been suggested as if we have all learners learning together, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of needs, we get to difference. And as a result of being used to difference, we become more tolerant and more empathetic towards others, and we better understand people. And as a result of that, as those tolerant children become tolerant adults, we have a more tolerant society, and we have this kind of virtuous circle where these perspectives are kind of passed down from generation to generation. So those are some of the key arguments about why all learners should be taught together in an inclusive setting. However, as with many things, there are also arguments that can be put in place as well. And some of these things link to perceptions. Okay, perceptions of self, which we'll pick up on shortly, perceptions of your peers in class, perceptions of staff. Thinking back to your own time in school, were all your teachers nice, friendly, empathetic, welcoming people that had your best interests in mind? And well with all of your teachers. Do teachers have the right amount of training and support and resources and funds to be able to meet learners' needs? Okay, now I started teaching in 1996, and when I started teaching, I remember going into my first week, having a chat with my mentor, who was a deputy head at the school, who was in his early 60s and was retiring the year after. And he talked to me for a long time about how great teaching was, and then came up with this comment: I'm really glad I'm retiring because I find there are too many children with needs in my class and I don't know what to do. I finished teaching in schools in December 2014, and the head of unit that I was working in was retiring that month, and he said something very, very similar. And his comment was, with a few swear words built into it, really glad I'm retiring because I'm sick to death of having learners with needs and increasing levels of needs in my classroom. So 18 years apart, those two members of staff who were reaching the end of their career felt that there were too many learners with needs in their class and they didn't have the support and training to meet those needs. When I did my PGC, I had 20 hours of SEN training, and that was an optional module. A few years ago, I used to teach a master's degree just looking at dyslexia. When I started teaching, I had 1 hour of dyslexia training, and I was expected to go into secondary schools and know what I was doing. Okay, so do staff have enough training, resources and support to meet everyone's needs? Do some learners have impact on others? So a really common argument put in place for some learners not being in mainstream school links to learners whose behaviour can be challenging. As a parent, you have arguments, well, I don't want that boy in my son's class because he's difficult and that means my son's going to miss out on learning. Okay, so there are potential barriers and negatives linked to inclusion. So again, just going to give you a couple of minutes really on that Padlet, which again is on the QR code or is also already on the module. Are there any potential benefits or negatives to think of in relation to inclusion? And I know this morning we haven't really nailed down what the definition is. Right, so if we think of inclusion as being all learners together, are there possible examples of benefits of that in your opinion? Do you think there are also potential negative impacts of that? Okay, again, no right or wrong answer. In your groups, I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so to post some thoughts on there if you don't mind. Okay, so inclusion, whatever that means, what are the benefits of it? What are the potential problems? Okay. And in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to look at some of the barriers and challenges to this. And as I said last week, one of those key barriers might be us as individuals and what you think. Okay, so a few minutes then. Any potential advantages or disadvantages you can think of in relation to inclusion, and we're going to suggest inclusion for now is learners all being together. All right, so why is that a good thing? Why might that be problematic? You're all suspiciously quiet. Okay, so another few minutes again then, please. Any potential advantages you can think of having all learners, regardless of needs, together? Any potential negative impacts you can think of in terms of that? Thank you for posting. Okay, really nice comment just been posted then. Thank you very much for that, group. Okay, having all learners together encourages understanding, empathy and acceptance of those who are different in whatever way that might be. We will look at this next week, brilliant, in terms of ableist and prejudiced views. So potentially if we see all learners together and focus on what those learners can do, we might be more empathetic and understanding of others. So thank you for posting that one. Okay, so having all learners together might lead to a more well-rounded education. Okay, one of the things I said last week that I really believe in, we learn from and with each other. If we learn from and with people who are different, then that's going to give us a more rounded understanding. Learning about differences is positive. Negatives might be bullying and exclusion. Okay, not enough training potentially for staff, so inclusion might be a good thing in theory, but we need support teachers more to be able to put it into practice. Okay, might not be enough in terms of funding. Equally, the expectations we have of teachers might be too much. Are we expecting teachers to do things that they're not appropriately trained or qualified or supported or have the time to do? Okay, so thank you for posting those. I think some quite difficult to answer this one potentially. So I'll leave that up for another minute or so and then we'll move on to the next bit. Okay, but some common themes you've mentioned there in terms of why it might be a good thing. Seeing that difference becomes normal, as a result become more tolerant. However, if we're all together, maybe difference is still a reason to be picked on or bullied or teased by other people. thank you for posting. Right. I'm just going to move on to this next bit for a couple of moments. So, again, thank you for posting your comments. Those comments will stay up on Canvas as we go through. So, how many of you remember your parents or grandparents saying something like this? Okay, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names or words will never hurt me. Okay, how many of you would suggest that that is true? How many of you still remember the names that you might have been called, or children that you were aware of in your school were called even years later? Do we remember those things more? Yeah. Did you want to say it, or are you just putting your hand up? Okay. Thank you for sharing. So, yeah, we kind of tend to suggest that, you know what, names don't mean anything. If you call something in school, if you're teased, if you're picked on, people are calling you names, well, just forget about it. However, I think this one is probably more true. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can really hurt me. Okay, and we're just going to mention some labels and terminology that people have had attached to them over time, and think a little bit about whether being labelled is beneficial or not. Okay, so we're going to think about some of these terms shortly. However, thinking about all of you in the room, all of us have labels attached in terms of our names, for example. Our names are quite powerful. Has anybody heard of a lady called Izuawobi? Okay, and Izuawobi is a professor of law who was born in Nigeria, qualified as a lawyer in Nigeria, moved to Swansea in the 1980s, I think, with her young family, and is now Welsh government. And I remember listening to her speaking a couple of months ago, and she was talking about the power of labels, and in particular in relation to race and some of the things that she was called and some of the things her growing up and being young adults in Swansea, but I think is quite pertinent to some of these labels as well. And one of the key stories she talked about was going into the job centre in Swansea in the 1980s and telling the lady who was the careers advisor that she was a qualified lawyer and she was looking to apply for jobs in law in Swansea. And the first thing she said was, person that, and they laughed in my face. And they said to her, no, that's not going to happen. Nobody in Swansea is going to employ someone who looks like you as a lawyer. Okay, the next thing the person asked her is, what is your name? She said, okay, my name is Uzu. And the person went, no. No one is going to employ anyone called Uzu, because, well, how do I spell? She said, do you have another name that I can call you? And she said, Nigeria. It's not uncommon, excuse me, that people kind of have a Nigerian first name and a kind of more English sounding second name. And she said, my middle name is Linda. And then she said, well, my advice for you today is to now on be known as Linda, because people might employ you as a Linda, but no one is going to employ you as Uzu. And equally, when you leave this office today, forget about going into law. What you need to do is go and look for jobs as a shop assistant. Because as a woman who looks like you, that's the only work you are going to do. Okay, so I think that's quite shocking, being as recent as the 1980s. However, if we think about some of those perceptions, do learners who have labels attached to them have similar challenges they experience? Now, all of these labels up on the board here are labels that are official terms that learners have been given over time. Some of these, I think, we would probably be sacked if we were used. However, many of these were standard medical definitions. Okay, so thinking about one of the worst ones, for example, sounds relatively inoffensive today, perhaps. We use this as quite a throwaway word, but idiot. the start of the 20th century, someone who was labelled as an idiot had been decided by a doctor with less than 30, and that meant they were incapable and they might be a danger to themselves and other people. So what we need to do with these people who might be dangerous is put them in an institution. And many people were locked away in asylums and homes for the rest of their life because they were labelled as idiots. These people have got no way of looking after themselves. Let's take these away and put them somewhere else. Slightly better was a moron. Okay, so this was someone who had an IQ of about 31 to 50. Still might be a danger to yourself and others, but you had a bit more intelligence. Again, probably what was going to happen to you was being locked away in an institution. Imbecile, similar, little bit more intelligence. Maybe you didn't need to be institutionalised, but school wasn't for you. What you needed to do was to be kept at home out the way so that you weren't a danger to other people. Anyone heard of this one before? Someone who was seen as being morally defective. Okay, this was someone who had been diagnosed by the doctor as someone who lacked the intelligence to know the difference between right and wrong. And potentially they could become a criminal. Hadn't done anything. Maybe they were easily led, and they could be led into criminal behaviour. Key group of people labelled morally defective were unmarried teenage mothers in particular. At the start of the 20th century, well, do you know what? Those women didn't realise it was morally wrong to get pregnant outside of marriage. So what we're going to do is that woman and her child up in an institution. Okay. Feeble-minded doesn't have a particularly positive connotation. Okay, you're not an idiot or a moron, but you know what, your mind, your brain is still a little bit feeble. It's not that great, doesn't work properly. Educationally subnormal. Do you still hear this being used in America sometimes? Sub meaning underneath. In other words, you've been diagnosed by someone as being at a level where you are below the normal level to go to school. There was a big scandal in the 1960s and 1970s in particular in some of the big cities in England, Birmingham and London in particular, about how black children were treated. And just because of the colour of their skin, they were identified as being educationally subnormal and put into special school settings. Handicapped. Does that sound a particularly positive term? Okay. Sorry to tell you, but your child's a little bit delicate. Okay, we don't have mental or physical toughness to go to school, so there's no point in sending them. Okay, sorry to tell you, but you're disabled. Okay, if we break that term down, dis meaning not. So you are not able to do something. Focuses on what you can't do. Sorry to tell you, but you or your child is uneducable. We've done some tests and we've decided you can't learn, therefore there's no point in you going to school. So what we're going to do is lock you up in an institution or tell your parents to keep you at home, because what's the point? Okay, you're just going to get into other people. Okay. Any of these terms on there do you think sound, if not less negative, any of them sound a bit more positive or a bit more neutral? Are there any there that you would get a sense of pride from, for example? Okay. Even things like deaf is a contentious issue. Okay. Do you identify as deaf with a lowercase d or a capital D? Does anyone know the difference between them? I've got to be honest, this was something I only learnt about 10 years ago. Somebody who identifies as deaf with a capital D, there is a culture linked to that. And that is someone who has decided not to learn lip reading, and their main form of communication is sign language. So there is a cultural aspect to that. Somebody with a lowercase d is either someone who has kind of lost their hearing, or has learnt kind of lip reading and to verbalise. So they've made that decision to fit in with communication with others. Okay. In the 1970s, children today who would now have social, emotional or mental health needs, 10 years ago had social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. 20 years ago had emotional and behavioural difficulties. In the 1970s they were known as they were defined as children who had decided to behave in a way that they knew was wrong. In other words, they had actively chosen to be naughty. Okay, so some of these labels not particularly positive. Okay, so if you were looking at your kind of transcript at the end of the year and someone had gone, okay, you had 58 in that module, brilliant, but you know what, I think you're an imbecile, that's probably not going to do an awful lot for your mental health and self-esteem going forward. Okay, so some of these labels can be quite challenging. And what I'm going to ask you to think about over the next couple of weeks as well is there any potential benefit of giving learners labels, or are the impacts of labels all negative? I've put up on the screen some examples in the literature for or against labelling. So if we give learners labels, eventually we start to understand some of the needs and challenges and hopefully strengths that those learners who've got the same label have. Okay, so if we start assessing and giving people the label autistic, is that beneficial? Because that means we now know more about learners with autism. Okay. Has anybody seen the film Rain Man? Which is quite an old film now. It's got Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman in it. It talks about Tom Cruise finding out when his father dies that he's got this unknown relation that lives in an institution, which is an older brother that he'd never met, and he was severely autistic. And in the end, they kind of build up a friendship, mainly because he realises he's at his level in terms of maths, and he's got a photographic memory. And he kind of busts him out of this asylum that he's living in and takes him to Las Vegas to try and earn a fortune playing rigged card games. Once that film came out, for example, autism that wasn't really known about that much in the 1980s became known as Rain Man syndrome, unofficially. Okay, so people talked a lot about Rain Man syndrome, and you know what? Anyone who was autistic must have been like Dustin Hoffman's character, and they were some kind of genius in something, which isn't the case. In the 1960s, autism, again not very well known about, was called refrigerator mother syndrome. This was a child who struggled to socialise with other people because their mother was really uncaring and cold towards them. Again, interesting at the time that it wasn't refrigerator father syndrome, for example. Okay, so labels potentially can increase awareness. However, potentially, labels mean we see the label and not the person behind it. So you might be working in a class where you've got two children who've got the label autistic. However, their traits and characteristics and how they react in class might be very different. Focus on the label, we might be meeting the needs of one of those learners, but not the other. Okay. Just going to skip on to a couple of slides. Just want to mention this briefly, and we'll pick up on this again in a few weeks' time. Has anyone heard these phrases here before? Locus of control and learned helplessness. Okay. How many, quick show of hands, have had experience of working with teaching assistants? Okay, so quite a few of you. Okay, I've been a teaching assistant in the past as well. Really challenging job, difficult circumstances, get paid far less than teachers do very often to do the same thing, and in some cases more, and perhaps working with some of the most challenged or challenging behaviours in the class as well. One of the key things that we talk about in terms of labels is that we lead to something called learned helplessness. Okay, and I'm going to mention a lady that I used to teach years ago because she's given me permission to talk about it. And her name was Juliet. And I met Juliet about 8 years ago when in a different university of age. And she'd come back later on in life to do a degree in education studies because she wanted to qualify as a teacher. And Juliet talked about the struggles that she'd had in school. She left school when she was 15 because she could at the time. She was told that she was stupid. She was told that she was thick. She was told that the best that she could hope for was to find a nice man and marry and become a wife and a mother. And that's perhaps all she should aspire to. She came into class one evening in big fits of tears. And she went, on one hand today I'm really happy, and on another hand today I'm really bloody annoyed, was her words, slightly stronger. And she went, today at the age of 56, I've had a diagnosis of dyslexia. I've also been told that I would benefit from having a diagnosis of ADHD. When I was in school 40 years ago, all my teachers told me I was thick. And I went through school believing I was thick. And she talked about when she was in school to be a nurse, and that was her dream at the time. And she didn't because everyone told her she was stupid. And she couldn't do it. Why was the point? There's no way you're going to be a nurse. You're too stupid. And she talked about the fact that she was happy in one hand that she'd had that diagnosis, she had that label, because it explained some of the difficulties she faced in school. And she went, at the age of 56, I can stand in front of anyone and tell them I am dyslexic, I am not stupid. What really annoyed her was that it had taken her to the age of 56 to find that out. And the impact of not having that label on her, she suggested, had a massive impact on her entire life. She left school when she was 15, she was stupid, couldn't get a career, spent 30 years working part-time in a shop. She became a mum at 17. She said, I don't regret any of that, but my life could have been different if someone had understood what my challenges were when I was younger. Okay, and she talked about the fact that she suffered from learned helplessness when she was in school. In other words, people told her that she couldn't. You know what, Juliet, you can't do that, don't bother. Don't bother trying. There's no point in putting you in for your O levels in English because, well, you're not going to pass. And she internalised that. And she said, actually, you know what, it disabled me in many ways because I listened to what people told me and I learnt that I was helpless. What was the point of me trying? So just thinking a little bit about some of the impact that people's terminology is powerful. If somebody tells you that you are a moral, are you going to internalise that? Are you going to live down to those expectations that people have of you? Thinking back to one of the purposes of education in Wales, having ambitious, capable learners. As teachers, do we have sufficient ambitions and aspirations for every learner that we teach? Okay, I worked in a pupil referral unit for 10 years with children who'd been excluded from school, and it was amazing how many of those children came to the unit and got really cross when they were told that they were going to be doing some work that day. And they'd kind of went, well, when I was in school, I was just told as long as you sit there quietly and do some colouring in, that was as much that was expected of me. Why are you now telling me I've got to do something? So their teachers had a big impact in terms of their aspirations. Going to come back to some of those slides next week, but I just wanted to spend the next 10 minutes or so asking you to take a quick review that I kind of met last year. Some But what you've got here are some ideas about these learners who I've called Simon, John, Harry, William, Sophie, Charlie, Mary, and really desperately hoping I don't slip up and say their real name as we go through. But these are learners that I used to work with at one time in this particular unit. They were kind of aged between 10 and 17, and they were all in the same class, which isn't brilliant to start with. And they all had a range of different needs, range of different labels attached, range of different things that were going on. And what I'd like you to do, okay, is maybe pick one or two of those. See, did they have any particular labels attached to them? If they did, what do you think some of those challenges? Do you think negative? Was there anything going on outside of school that might be impacting upon those learners? All right, so all of those learners have been excluded from school. In some cases, 3, 4, 5 schools. In some cases, 3, 4, 5 schools before they got to the age of 9. Okay, so take a look at one or two of those learners. Each one of them needs, the bottom part of it is talking about things going on in their families. Okay, and I'd just like you to kind of pick up anything that you can see in terms of the needs you think they had, the labels that they were given. All of these learners have been kicked out of school and sent to this particular little unit out of the way. Do you think those learners were being included? Do you think teachers saw those learners differently because of the labels they had? Okay. So you don't have to post anything this time. I'll just ask you to kind of share some verbal feedback if you're happy to shortly. Okay, so a range of different learners there. The only thing I've changed is the name. As you can see there, most of those are male. There's only 2 girls on there. And thinking about the unit I worked in, we had 102 pupils in 10 years, only 4 of them were girls. Okay, so 98 of those pupils were boys. Okay, which again potentially it says something about inclusion and how teachers perceive children who might be challenging or have difficult needs. Okay, so they've all been kicked out of school. They've all been excluded. They've all been sent somewhere else out of the way. Are they being included? Are they segregated? Are they excluded? What are their needs? What labels have they got? How do you think their teachers might have perceived their needs based on their labels? Doing that, we've been talking a little bit this morning about being in mainstream school. Thinking about those learners in most cases went through multiple mainstream schools. Things got difficult, the strategy was to go and send them somewhere else. However, they ended up in this unit, which they were never meant to stay long term. However, in all cases, stayed until they were 17. Okay, as a group of learners, they actually asked the school to build them a 6th form because they didn't want to leave. Some of these learners have now gone on to university. So I bumped into one about 18 months ago, for example, who's now a trainee educational psychologist. Equally, I bumped into one in Boots the Chemist the other day who's just come out of prison after 7 years for attacking his ex-girlfriend and her parents, for example. So there have been some positive life trajectories for some of these, but equally some negative ones as well. Okay, so I'll give you another few minutes and then I'm just going to ask you if you particular thoughts that you're happy to share about the learning? Okay, so different needs, different things going on in life. The only constant really in school was they were pushed away and sent somewhere else. Could things have been done differently? Should things have been done differently? Would their life have turned out differently if things had been done that way? Okay, we will pick up on some of these in the seminars tomorrow as part of it as well. Appreciate I haven't given you very long, and I also appreciate that I'm going to let you go. Anybody got any thoughts about the learning they've looked at? Anything that anyone is happy to share in terms of what you've read about your particular learner? Anything that stands out to you in particular? Thank you very much. Thank you. So there were educational things going on, there was learning things going on, but all of those learners had some kind of challenge in families as well. Okay, are you kind of confident with terms like adverse childhood experiences, for example, ACEs? Okay, a lot of these children today would probably have been diagnosed as having adverse childhood experiences that were impacting on them. So that link between home and school is a nice one for sharing that one. Anything anyone's picked up in terms of kind of learning needs or education needs, other than all of them, the schools had kicked them out? Well, anything if you've looked at multiple ones that they had in common? You're all very quiet this morning, I won't push the point. So, just moving on slightly then. So, very quick recap. This is what we've kind of looked at this morning. So, we've started to think a little bit about what inclusion means. Learners together, regardless of needs, in the main. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's all learners working in the place that best meets their needs, and it doesn't matter what type of school. It doesn't mean that either. We've mentioned a little bit about some of the positives and negatives of inclusion. Didn't spend an awful long time looking at it, but you were talking about things. If we spend time with people who are different, we become more tolerant. Or maybe we don't. Maybe what we do is focus on that difference, and it leads to things like bullying and segregation, for example. We've started to think about labelling. Is it a benefit to have that label? Now, for Juliet, she felt that it was, because it explains that. However, would it be fair to suggest that potentially better teachers at the time when she was in school might have picked up on some of her needs, and she wouldn't have needed the label to get support? Are some labels more challenging than others? Okay, one of the learners in that pack, for example, I remember talking to him one day, and this new learner started, and his first question was, what's the matter with you then? Okay, and the learner who just started had said, oh, I've got dyslexia and ADD. And he went, well, you're really lucky. I've got SCBD and ODD, and just such and such. So he was very aware of the perceptions people had of him because of his label. Didn't really pick up on these two things, but I've put them up on the slide, and we'll focus on these a little bit more next week when we look at perceptions. And again, we're going to pick up on this bit tomorrow towards the end of the seminars. Is there anything that we've looked at today and that we look at tomorrow that's made you think a little bit about what inclusion is? And you don't have to tell me now, right? But in your assignment, you're going to be reflecting, as I said, on that statement. Maybe something that's come out of this week was, doing the reading, I'd always thought inclusion meant being in mainstream school. However, also realise that mainstream school might not work for some learners, and therefore being in a special or inclusive. Okay? Right, very final thing, and Will. Do you know what seminar groups you're in for tomorrow? As I've got to be honest, I don't. All right. So those of you in group 1, we're upstairs in this maze of a building tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Those of you in group 2, we're over in the basement of the James Callaghan building. So it's behind the cafe bit in James Callaghan. I think it says something like history seminar room on the door. It's taken me 3 weeks to find the room we're in. And those of you that are in group 3, we're kind of just round the corner tomorrow afternoon. So if you keep hold of those pupil pen portraits, whoever's got hold of them on your desk at the moment, if you're happy to bring those with you to the seminar, we'll look at that a little bit again. There's 2 very brief newspaper articles I've put up on Canvas. If you get a chance to glance through those by not, don't. You tomorrow. Okay? All right. Best before you go, please just ask.